Everyone. Welcome to This Week in Moral Psychology. Today I come to you from an apartment in Vienna, Austria, and I'm a little foggy-headed because of the airplane ride and all that. But let's go ahead and jump into our next theory of desire, which is the learning-based theories of desire. The learning-based theories of desire are in some ways the least intuitive views of desire, though Tim Schroeder seems to do, I think, a pretty good job of making his views seem plausible. In Schroeder's book, he talks about three phases of desire. The first phase he talks about is this motivational element. It seems as if I want a cup of coffee, I'm motivated to get a cup of coffee. The other phase of desire is pleasure. When I get the coffee, I'm pleased with the fact that I've gotten the coffee. I also am pleased in the thought of getting the coffee. And so there seems to be pleasure related to desires. The third phase he mentioned is reward, and in particular that it's constituted by the activity in the neurological reward system. And this was talked about in his chapter on pain or pleasure and pain, and the other chapter preceding this one. So he first stipulates this reward theory of desire, which has it that you have an intrinsic desire, that P is to use the capacity to perceptually or cognitively represent that P to constitute P as reward. To be adverse to it, to being the case that P is to use the capacity to perceptually or cognitively represent that P to constitute P as punishment. So let's look at the first part of this. To have an intrinsic desire, that P is to use the capacity to perceptually or cognitively represent that P as reward. What he's saying here is that if I desire pizza, what this ultimately means is that I have a capacity and that I'm using this capacity to represent having the pizza as reward. So somehow I would find that to be rewarding. And if I'm considering having a pizza, then and that entails having the desire that I have a pizza. What this means is that I've represented that state of affairs as a reward or to my reward system. Desire here, in Schroeder's terms, is very broad. He includes things like goals or wishes or ends or wants and all those types of things. He doesn't want to include things like intentions or plans or episodes of trying or believing about what is good. Those aren't the types of things he wants to include in his theory of desire. But in particular, desire, though, he thinks is meant to include wishes about how the past might have been, and also desires for the future and for the present. He wants to include all these types of things in his scope of the term desire. One of the most salient features of the reward theory is that it distinguishes between positive desires and negative aversions. Positive desires open one to being rewarded if the content is satisfied, but these negative aversions, they open one up to be punished if the content is satisfied. So if I have a desire, a positive desire, then what this indicates is that I'm going to be pleased, or maybe not even pleased, but somehow rewarded if I obtain that thing. So if I want a drink of this Coca-Cola next to me, I want it if the content is satisfied. So if I'm rewarded by the content, rather, if I'm rewarded by the content being satisfied, then that's a desire. But if I am if I have a negative desire, then this negative version rather, then this opens me up to being punished if it's satisfied. And Here he wants to say something like being adverse to something, like someone's lateness, is not the same thing as having a positive desire for its opposite. So for Adam to be on time. So say if you have a date with someone and you expect them to be there at noon, you might want them to be there at noon, but you don't want them to not be late, right? So it's not like you're desiring that they um, come at some other time or something. A person who positively desires Adam being on time is prone to delight in his being on time, and a person who simply just is averse to Adam's lateness will be not necessarily relieved, but delighted that he was on time, right? So this aversion sets one up for anxiety or relief. So if I'm averse to something, I'll get anxious about it. But if I'm in a positive desire, it's setting you up for joy or disappointment if it isn't fulfilled. It's important to note that theories of reward distinguish between something called a positive reward, an intuitive reward, and a negative reward, a non-occurrence rather, of an expected punishment. So a positive reward will be something like the taste of the Coca-Cola that you're wanting to drink, and you get that reward when you drink it. A negative reward would be something like, you got in trouble when you were a kid and you expected to have to do some sort of consequence, but your parents let you off the hook, right? So it's a non-occurrence of expected punishment. You also have things called a positive punishment, and that's an intuitive punishment, something you expect in a way, and a negative punishment, a non-occurrence of expected reward. So sometimes, when you're a kid or something, you do a chore, like take out the trash, and you always get a dime or a nickel or something every time you do it, but this time you didn't, so that's a negative punishment. That's what they would call that. Further, though, the rewards theory invokes this notion of perceptual or cognitive representations. It's important that from these representations, or rather the capacities for these representations, that desires are able to get the object of the desire. So the idea is from the representational the perceptual or cognitive representations, those are enabling you to to perceive and understand the world in a way that gives the content to the desire. So what the desire is about. So if I desire Coca-Cola, and I keep using that, but I have a can of Coke right there. If I desire Coca-Cola, I can look over and I see the Coke, and then I want the Coke because it represents a reward to me. Schroeder says representations involved in desires, and so the contents of desires may, according to this theory, be any degree of abstraction or concreteness and found anywhere in a basic perceptual system or most abstract reasoning centers of the brain. So the idea here is that it's not the case that you only can want things that are very concrete. You can also want things that are very abstract, like the pi to not be 3.14, etc., but to be 3.15, right? 3.16. So you can want that in this theory. That would be okay. Some theories that wouldn't be possible because those theories of the desire have it such that you only can want things that are possibly obtainable. An advantage then of this theory it receives from having desired contents derived from perceptual or cognitive content is that it explains this interesting symmetry and another asymmetry between desires and cognitive content. So the symmetry is in fact that the possible contents of my perceptions and beliefs are identical to the possible contents of my desire. This isn't to say that any cognitive or perceptual representation is sufficient to give desires, right? So if the reward theory is right, then mental representations can exist without having desires. But on the flip side, though, in order to have a desire, you have to have some sort of mental representation. So a mental representation in this view then would be a necessary condition for having a desire. So this might be slightly confusing though, that a desire including perceptual cognitive representations might seem confusing, but what's confusing about this seems to infer that you can only desire something if you're cognitively, if you're aware of that desire at the moment. So it seems that there's only these occurrent desires are possibly characterized as desire. So what he says is, does this mean that every time one perceives a pie, he also desires it? Does it mean that one cannot desire the well-being of a child without thinking that of the child's well-being? And he says no. So this theory of desire doesn't include specific instances of desire. That's what he calls token representations, like desiring that your child live a long and healthy life or a piece of pie. All that he says is necessary though is that your desires be so organized that on an instance where you would would have a desire about that, then it would contribute to the production of this reward signal. So the idea is that I don't have to have particular instances of desiring in order to have this reward signal produced, but so I might not desire Chex Mix or something like that, or a Coca-Cola at the moment or something. But if I'm desiring, and I might not ever have thought about pizza, but if all of a sudden I see pizza and I want it, then what this means is that it was the case that on the instance of me seeing this pizza, then I would want it. Then it would contribute to the production of this reward signal. And so that's kind of foundational to his view, because he thinks that this production of the reward signal, stimulation of the reward center, is the essence of having the desire. So he thinks that production of the reward signals, or not necessarily the production of them, but having a reward stimulus, this is the desires, the wanting aspect of life. Now, the desire theory, this RTD desire theory, does require a link between representational capacities and the reward signals, but the link, what is happening is you're representing something as in such a way that it produces this reward signal. There's some sort of link between the representations and a reward signal. It does seem to work well with the view that people who are asleep still have desire. So how does this work? This works is that imagine someone is asleep, or they're anesthetized or in a coma. For them to have a desire is for them to be organized in such a way that were certain things, certain states of affairs to be represented, then it would produce the reward signal in the brain. So, they're asleep, but if they were awake and you showed them a pizza, then that would contribute to the production of the reward signal. And so, because this production of the reward signal is the desire for him. So some people might be wondering how he's counting something as perceptual or cognitive, as a perceptual cognitive representation. He's not too concerned about that. All he wants to claim is that it's content bearing thing. So the point he wants to make is that something to be counted as perceptual or cognitive in a representation has to be content bearing, and it has to give you some sort of propositional content. So if I have a proposition, it's that it's cold outside. The content is it's cold outside. And so it's any sort of event or state of affairs or thing that is content bearing, that gives you content. So he would count that as perceptual or cognitive representation. He also thinks that it has to be localized or distributed in certain regions of your brain. So to summarize his view, then he says to constitute something as a reward or punishment is to use a representation of it to drive the production of a reward or a punishment. The reward and punishment signals then in turn are able to be understood in terms of learning theory, so that you learn this is a reward, this is a punishment. So something is a reward if it is represented to drive the production of reward signals. And is a punishment if it's represented in such a way that it drives a punishment signal. Reward signals in any event are that causes a characteristically and mathematically describable form of learning, and a punishment signal is any event that causes the opposite form of learning. So you have this reward signal that is causes a characteristically mathematically form a specific kind of learning, and that's going to be the learning theory and the reward theory are the same. So you have a learning-based theory of desire, which is that your a particular kind of rewards-based learning is the same is neurologically the same as the desire. So Schroeder introduces a new version of the reward theory. He says to have an intrinsic or positive desire, that P, is to embody the capacity to perceptually or cognitively represent that in a system, the biological function of which is constitute P as reward. So the idea here is that if you desire pizza, then you have the capacity to represent pizza or having pizza as a reward to yourself. And so then a desire then would be that capacity to represent something as a reward. And if you're having that desire, then you're representing it as a reward to yourself. So that would be the rewards-based theory. So according to this theory, though, a desire exists when there is, or is supposed to be, some sort of stable connection between this representational capacity and the reward system. In addition, though, this desire has to last just so long as this connection lasts. So where you're unable to represent something as a reward system to yourself as a reward, then you can't have the desire anymore. When your desire is satisfied, then you feel good, right? So feelings of dissatisfaction then are also likely to disappear. If I have a desire for something and I don't get it, then I'll feel sad. If I have a desire for something and I get it, then other feelings of dissatisfaction will dissipate as well. But he wants to claim that neither the feeling of dissipation or motivation to obtain the thing or a decreased motivation to obtain a thing since you already have it, these aren't the desires themselves, as the hedonistic system or the pleasure-based theory and the motivational theory suggest. He wants to say, so consider his desire that he lives a fairly decent life. This is an intrinsic desire. But then on his deathbed, it's clear that he accomplished his goal, his life has been good, and his desires have been satisfied right before he dies. So he recognizes this. At the same time, though, he notices that there's nothing he can change in his life overall to make it go the other way. Like not even if he was to be cruel to his children or anything like that, he couldn't, given the time that was remaining, bring his life's average decency below what could be hoped for. So having clearly satisfied desires, it will now be the case that he ceases to have this desire. So that's a question, right? Certainly an anxiety that he might have about the overall shape of of his desire will be eliminated if his feelings are appropriate to the occasion and he is not motivated by his desires to do one or two less, great things to balance the sheet overall, then it can be said that he has a desire. Imagine that you have a desire for something and then you've achieved it, right? So in the case that he gives is that your daughter goes to Harvard or something. So you have this desire that your daughter goes to Harvard. Now, the question is, can this desire persist even though it took place? And Schroeder thinks that it can. So he says there's a fact that one is motivated to bring the topic up, the fact that one takes pleasure in it, and so on. And these are indications he thinks that you still want it, right? So it's true, you wouldn't say, I want my daughter to have attended Harvard, thank God she did. So that's not what you're saying, but what happens is you have these positive attitudes about it. You bring it up. You have hopes about it. Still, it's true that you think it's good for them for her to go to Harvard. And so what this would do then for you is it would produce reward signals in your brain, in the reward center, the reward learning center, and this production of the signal of to your reward learning center is then what he would call a desire.